At Habersham Mills, the whistle no longer blows to mark the changing of shifts. The buildings where people once made their living and lived their lives are gone forever. And the same story is repeated throughout the South in hundreds of small towns and villages. The jobs that once supported the families and the economy of the towns and villages are now in other places. Life in the mill village at Habersham was very similar to life in other mill villages across the South. Mill workers went into the mill at the beginning of their shifts until the whistle sounded for the shift to change. They went home to the houses owned by the mill, rented for a very small fee. They bought their food and supplies in the company store and played baseball for the team, and their children attended a schoolhouse owned by the Habersham Mills. These people developed friendships and ties that ran deep enough to last a lifetime. They all cared for each other. They didn't lock their doors, and they always felt safe and secure. And the mill village provided an enchanted environment for children to grow up in.
I grew up there. I went to school there. It was a wonderful place to grow up. Looking back on it and seeing the way that things are now versus the way that things were there in the mill village, it was just night and day. I mean, it was a great place to grow up. We had very little traffic there, so kids, we rode bicycles. We rode bicycles everywhere we went. And then we had trails. If we weren't going on the paved ground, we had trails that went through the woods to various people's houses and streets and stuff like that. We played with everybody there. I mean, we knew where all the children lived, and we'd get together after school and in the summertime playing, just having a real good time. You couldn't do a whole lot of misbehaving there because everybody knew who you were and everybody knew your mother and daddy, and it was just like somebody said one time, it was like having 50 mother and daddies out there watching after you.
Oh, I've got a lot of memories at school. Everybody walked to school, and we lived about a mile from the school, and you'd have to walk to school, walk home in the afternoon. We'd get 30 minutes recess in the morning, an hour for lunch, and 30 minutes in the afternoon. Sometimes I could run home and eat lunch and come back, but a lot of times we'd take our lunch and eat it at school. But the ball field was right below the schoolhouse, and we played a lot of baseball. And we could start at 10 o'clock in the morning at recess, and we'd choose up sides. I don't know if you remember growing up how you'd do that, but you'd pitch the bat, somebody grabbed the bat, and then you'd go up the bat, and the one that could hold to the top of the bat and throw it over the shoulder got to choose first. So they'd try to choose the best player, you know. But we would choose up sides. We would play part of the game. Lunch we'd play, and in the afternoon we could finish up a 9-inning game. So baseball was a big thing. Another thing that was the playground. You know, I've got a picture of it, but it don't show they had a slide and swings. And I remember there was a fire hydrant that sat out on the side of the road, and every kid who ever went to Habersham School played on top of the fire hydrant. But it was a good place to go to school. 7 grades, and then after the 7th grade, we went to North Habersham High School.
I look forward to when the school was out, because we always had plays. Ms. Aubrey Motts, she was one of the superintendents. Her husband was one of the superintendents at the mill. And anyway, Miss Motts would come to the school, and she would have plays like Halloween, Christmas, and at the end of the year we'd always have plays. And I remember one time I was the king of one of the plays, and also Santa Claus at one period. But anyway, we really enjoyed the teaching, the teachers, and they were one of the best. And but anyway, Mr. Stribling, Mr. Earl, the only one that he'd hire was they had to be single, and he didn't allow any dating during the week. Anyway, and their house, they had a house right next to this Mr. Stribling, and all the teachers lived there. They had maids to take care of everything. And but anyway, that was it was always a mystery to me.
School was great. I loved it. And one thing I remember, we always walked to school, and we had recess at 10 o'clock. Well, the first day at school, me and my neighbor, Larry Moss, we walked to school, and we got the impression that they said when the bell rings, it's time to go home. Well, we didn't know the bell rang at recess and at lunch, and then time to go home. So when the bell rang at 10 o'clock for recess, we went home. And our mothers walked us all the way back to school. And we had to learn that the bell, just because it rang, didn't mean it's really time to go home.
The house I lived in, it was just like the rest of them. The later ones, they tell me they were built in 1927. And when you face the house, you got a little porch. The 3 rooms went down on the left side, 2 on the right. And they were very cold. And that day, when they built that house, the ceilings were about 10 feet high. Well, you know, your heat goes up and you know what happens. So they were hard to heat. And then on top of that, they had what I call groove ceiling. It wasn't a paper board like we got now. It let through a lot of air, and they were hard to heat, but we burned a lot of coal and wood.
The school was a wonderful school. It was we had great teachers, grades 1 through 8 during my time. I think I started attending in first grade in 1943, graduated in 1951, with a total of 13 people in our class. I think there were 10 boys and 3 girls. And but we had, one of the things that Habersham Mills did back in those days, they subsidized the salaries of those teachers. So we were able at Habersham to acquire really good teachers and role models that I can remember to this day of how they impacted our lives and what they meant to those kids. And you know, in talking to my peer group these days, they still remember them all, and I think hold them in high esteem. The other thing I remember is I always heard that when the Habersham Mill students went to attend the public schools in the other towns surrounding, mainly Clarksville, that we were well prepared, better prepared than most, and so that we kind of stood out from that standpoint.
The school was, I liked the school. It was a modern school for its time, a brick school, and everyone saw pictures of it. Sadly, it was torn down a few years ago, but anyhow, I remember as I started the first grade there, the teacher told us if we could attend school every day that year, that she would give us a prize at the end of the year. And I was so determined that I was going to get that prize, I didn't miss a day, even though one day I came sick, which now they wouldn't let you come to school sick. But Mama didn't want me to go to school, but I got up out of bed and got ready and came, and I felt so bad, but I came to school, and at the end of the year it was worth it to me because I got a little prize of these, I don't know what you call them, you look through them and there's different colored rocks in there and you get all kind of shapes.
Kaleidoscope.
And I don't have that now, but I wish it was one of the red and never seen anything like it. That was my prize.
Oh, school was wonderful. We had a beautiful, beautiful school. And the mill paid the teachers, what do you get?
Subsidized?
A bonus, besides the county, what the county paid. So our teachers we had wonderful teachers and wonderful times. School was wonderful.
For the hundreds that populated a place that has vanished forever, Habersham Mills and the Mill Village represent a time that was. Settled in the early 1800s, the Habersham Mill began its existence as Stroop Iron Works, the first iron foundry in the state of Georgia. By 1841, it closed and did not open again until 1861 as the Habersham Iron Works to manufacture weapons and ammunition for the Confederate Army. By 1882, J.H. Porter took the reins and opened Porter Manufacturing Company, a wool weaving mill. Porter Mill added 25 mill homes, a post office, store, church, and school. Lofty building goals caused many financial problems, and the Porter Mill closed in 1905. In 1906, the mill was purchased by S.Y. Stribling and named the Habersham Mills. S.Y. Stribling, understanding the need for a working mill in the area, decided to take a trip to visit the mill. He arrived at the mill, and there was no one around, so he decided to go up and begin ringing the large mill bell to get the caretaker's attention. This begins the reign of the Habersham Mills. S.Y. decides to change the mill from wool to cotton yarn. His son, Earl Stribling, becomes plant superintendent, and his son-in-law, Aubrey Motts, becomes general superintendent.
What Mr. Earl, he took his, he had feelings for everybody, and he took it upon his heart. And I believe that's the reason he died at an early age, because he took all the problems of anybody else on his heart.
Mr. Earl was, I can tell you, Mr. Earl was a very smart man, a very, and actually I've got to say this, I only knew him for 4 years. I was born in 1937, he died in 1941. And so I only knew him for those 4 years, so a lot of this is secondhand, but he ran the mill with an iron hand. I mean, he was the president, he was the chief operating officer, he was the chief of police, he was the fire department, he was the human resources guy. He was all of it rolled into one, and that was just kind of the way it was back in those days in the textile mill families in the textile mill world. Mr. Earl graduated from Georgia Tech, #1 in his class in textile engineering, came to work immediately at the mill, and at some point, I've forgotten what his original title was, but at some point I believe he became superintendent in 1918, and he was president of the mill in 1941 when he passed away. And actually I think he worked part of the day in 1941 when he went home feeling ill and subsequently passed away, with my understanding, with heart failure. And the only thing I can remember about that as a kid, now I'm 4 years old, and the only thing I can remember about those, because my mom didn't let me go to funerals or anything like that back in those days, the only thing I can remember about that day is how many cars there were parked in and around Mr. Earl's house. I'd never seen that many cars in one place in my life.
That was before my time. All I heard about Earl was what Joe and Pap told me about. Joe was talking about, they had a little porch over the door, and he was a doing chin-ups on it, and Earl come out and he got on to him. That's about all I know. Earl was the law really of Habersham. I mean,
he was a wonderful, wonderful man. One time, Mom sent me to the store, and I had on my apron. My friend and I were, I don't know what we were pretending to cook, because we didn't get to do much cooking. You didn't waste ingredients. But we went to the store, and Mr. Earl made quite a well, he was wanting to know what we were cooking, and he just made us feel real special because we had on our aprons. And he would visit the school, seems like. I can't remember anything outstanding about it. I'll never forget the day he died, though. Oh, that was just a horrible time. And not too many years back, I went to an auction and bought a picture frame because it was old. And then I got to searching, who could this man be in the picture? And I went to all of the older people around, and it ended up that I was in a restaurant, and Catherine and Marion happened to be there. And I said, Marion, I've got a picture in my car. I wonder if you'd recognize it. And it was Mr. Earl.
Mr. Earl was my great uncle. And I did not know him, but some of the things that I have heard about him, I'll be glad to share. He too devoted everything that he had to the mill. He was from what I understand, he was a very stern person. There wasn't much joking around Mr. Earl. You had to do it, and you had to do it right, and you had to do it his way. And some way he had a habit of taking a knife and turning, and I've heard several folks say that he'd turn his knife around like this a lot. I don't know what the significance was to that, but he had lost one of his fingers, and the folks said that they remembered seeing him turning his knife around. Apparently that was something he did a whole lot. When they built the new mill, they used the lumber and the timber from Habersham County primarily. My father-in-law had a sawmill, and he sawed a lot of the timber, the big timbers, the 12 by 12s they used for the girders and for the posts, and the real big heavy timbers. And he said that Mr. Earl, when they brought a load down there, that Mr. Earl, they didn't unload any of it until Mr. Earl came there, and when they unloaded it, he was looking at every piece of timber that came in to make sure that it was up to grade. They said that he was paying a really high price at that time for the timber, but what he demanded was it had to be first class timber. And I can tell you, because we had to do some remodeling in the mill, and we had to remove some of that timber, and it was still just as solid as the day that it was put in. So that was money well spent on good materials.
By 1915, the plant is successfully running with workers living at the mill and enjoying their lives. Due to the shrewd knowledge of Aubrey Motts, the mill made its own electricity by building its own electric power plant. The mill also wired the mill homes with electricity free of charge. These were the first residents in the county to have electricity.
Well, a lot of the activity in terms of the electrical hydroelectric power coming to Habersham Mills happened before my time. It happened back in the 1915 to 1920 era, when all the mills were converting over to electricity, and they did convert Habersham Mills and install 2 power plants I don't have the dates of those. One predated the other, I'm sure. I think the lower plant was perhaps the first one. But anyway, that happened in that era. At the same time, in this part of the country, Georgia Power was installing power plants at Lake Burton, Lake Seed, Lake Raven, Lake Tugelo, and Lake Yona. So it was kind of the same era, the same thought process, the same engineering that went into both of those processes. The other thing that stands out to me is the fact that I have heard that there was much discussion about how to engineer the upper power plant so that an impoundment could be built, which is in place today, the upper dam, with basically a penstock through the mountain itself and into that power plant. And that was actually done, and I think my grandfather, Motts, was one of the ones that pushed for that project, and that really lobbied for it with the shareholders and the board to approve that.
We always had power. That was something. That was really something, because out in the country, nobody had power, but we had power and running water.
Well, I'll tell you what, it was different. They opened up 2 new streets, and they had 25 new houses, and we moved in one of the new houses. We had electric lights and running water. That's something that I'd never been used to. I was 3 years old when we moved there, and I was 15 when I left.
By the 1920s, a new brick schoolhouse was built, and by 1929, there were 120 mill homes and 200 families. In the 1930s, the Communist Party labor unions, called the Flying Squadrons, threatened the mills, but the Habersham Mill stood tall and guarded the livelihood of its workers. During those years, the mill built the houses of Newtown on the hill above the church.
I was born in the mill town, and actually a midwife, And then when I was about 3 or 4 years old, we lived across the river in one of the mill houses. We moved to what they call Newtown at the end of the line, and we stayed down there quite a while. I don't remember when, but when we first moved in, a little funny story was of an evening in the summertime. Nobody's supposed to have a hot plate, but you could turn on our porch light and you could see it just gradually getting dimmer and dimmer because people were cooking supper with a hot plate. And then we moved from there. Daddy and Mama wanted a wood stove. Everybody had to cook with wood, so it was hot. So Daddy had asked to get the house wired, and they said, he said there wasn't enough power really to be carried that far, but up top of that Newtown hill was a house that was unwired, and we moved from there up there, and that's where I lived till 1999.
Newtown was over there, as I understand it, and always known it to be, must have been some of the newer houses that were built over there where my friend Lewis Harper lived. And it was on another hill, of course. Every houses, it was either down in the bad area, up on a hill one. It's on another ridge, and up from the store, you go up a long hill and turn to the right, and then to the left, and down that street was what I knew as Newtown.
Well, it was great. Newtown was really great. I've been telling these little stories, and y'all may not want them, but we live at the end of the line on Newtown, and there's a family of Kings lived across the road from us. Well, one day Rudis was his name, and Daddy is talking. He had a hen. See, everybody had the animals sitting under the floor. And me and my brother was small, could just about walk under there, and he gave me his hat and said, "Junior, take the hen off the nest and you get the eggs." Well, the hen didn't like me getting her eggs, and she was kicking for my brother, and he said, "She's getting loose," and I run out from under the house. Well, and I thought the chicken got me, is what it was. After I raised up and hit one of the seals under the house, and I thought he'd done crippled me for life. Ruddy said, "You're the youngest fella I've ever known that was hen-pecked and never married." And they started laughing, and I run home to Mama, of course.
By the 1930s, President Roosevelt's New Deal, which demanded a minimum wage, maximum hours without overtime, and Social Security insurance, caused challenges at the mill. But no one ever got laid off. Earl Stribling would stagger shifts so that all employees kept their jobs. They might have only worked 30 hours some weeks, but they were still able to live at the mill and feed their families.
In the mid-70s, the whole economy slowed way down. The demand for cotton yarn was way down. Habersham worked as long as we could, storing the yarn and putting it in the warehouse, waiting on the economy to improve. But the longer we stayed, we just ran out of space to store the finished product. Plus, you have the cost that you are incurring, and we didn't have bottomless pockets. So what we had to do was we had to slow down. So what we did the first time is we laid off one shift for a week and allowed those shift folks to, in fact, we signed them up. We had the Georgia Department of Labor to come down and sign them up for unemployment insurance benefits. We did that, which that would be one shift, per week was off. We did that. We rotated the shift that was off. I think the first week, memory serves me right, it was the third shift that was off. And then the next week, the second shift was off. And the week after that, the first shift was off. And then, if memory serves me right, we went through that progression for another period of time. We had cut our production by a third, but it still wasn't enough. So what we had to do, we laid off 2 shifts per week and just worked 1 shift. And the 1 shift started off, I think we worked, the first shift was if memory serves me right, that was the first one that worked just 1 shift. Second and third shift was laid off. The second time, the third and the first shift was laid off, and then the first and the second and the third shift laid off. But we got through it, and then we were able to get everybody back on board after that. But that was a difficult time. But nobody lost their jobs, and everybody had some money coming in during the week. During that time, we didn't hire anybody because nobody was leaving. There was no jobs to be had. Everybody was just happy to have a job.
In 1941, Earl Stribling, known affectionately as Mr. Earl, suddenly died. The presidency of the mill was taken over by William Banks. The payroll for the mill was made in cash until 1960. Residents did not have good means of cashing checks, so management would go to the bank and take out all of the cash needed to pay all employees and bring it back to the mill, toting guns, of course, to hand out to employees. In 1946, Marion Stribling, grandson of S.Y. and son of S.Y. Stribling, Jr., returns from World War II and becomes the new superintendent. Marion Stribling is credited with modernizing the Habersham Mill.
Well, Marion was in college when we first few years when I lived there, but he was home through the summer, and he was always come home to play baseball. He was first baseman, and he was one of the best. And so Marion, and later on the years after, we both went to the service, and I met him several times after that, and he was one good feller. I mean, for superintendent of the mill, and I sold him vehicles after I came back out of service. So he was a one owner. He was a fine person. Yeah.
One thing I remember about Marion, he loved to rabbit hunt, and where we live now. I know when we had the dedication service for our new sanctuary that we're in now, he spoke, and he told about when he was growing up, how he would rabbit hunt up and down that creek behind the church there.
Dad was the president of the mill, and he had come up through, he had worked for several other textile plants before he came back here to Habersham. Dad was a true mill man. He knew a lot about textiles, and he was the man that sold the yarn for HabershamMill. Primarily, we sold our yarn up the East Coast to the same buyers over and over. We sold, he was a stern man. How can I get this placed? He was a very hands-on person. He was going to be around when there was anything going on. He was going to be there. He had a very good mechanical head, a lot of common sense, and he guided the whole mill, you know, in the direction that it was. He really took the mill. That was his whole life, was the mill, and he threw himself right in the middle of it, just as hard as he could.
Marion was a very fine fellow. I like Marion. Some people didn't get along with him real good, but me and Marion got along pretty good. We had an understanding with one another, and he was a fine fellow.
Well, Marion was a real good, fine guy. I really did like him. We didn't live too far from them, and I saw him quite a bit because Aubrey and his family lived right next door to Marion, and Aubrey and I we grew up pretty much the same. We're about the same age, and so I was over at their house a lot because we played together and played ball together and done a lot of things together. But Marion was a great disciplinarian too. I mean, he got your attention, not by being mean, but just by his demeanor. You know, just looking at him and him looking at you, you kind of pretty well got the message.
Well, Marion Strickland was a great man, I thought. I really enjoyed working for him, and I like to tell little tales, but when I was in the lab, they met with Georgia Tech. They had a program where that you would all mills get together and talk, and we were going to down there. I was one. Matter of fact, this jacket I bought, my daddy bought it because I was going to Atlanta. That was a big thing back then. And then we were going down, and Marion was driving. He said, "Kellis, look to your left." And I done spotted it, and there was a convertible with this blonde in it, and she had miniskirts wasn't popular at that time. And to clarify what he wanted me to see. I said, "You mean the cricket?" And I never did see or hear of another cricket little car. And I thought it was amusing. And he nicknamed me Quick Cricket for quite some time.
Well, yeah, Marion was, I consider him a mentor of mine. We lived next door. I remember very vividly when he and his wife Catherine were married, and he lived in the same. He came back to live in the same house he was born in, and lived there until after he retired, when Russell basically was closing the plant down. I believe that's the point at which he moved, bought his first home. Most of these guys, this is very interesting to me, most of the mill management had never owned a home of their own. They lived in mill homes, very, very nice mill homes, all of their life. My dad never owned a piece of property in Habersham County that I'm aware of. He and my mom lived in the same house from the time they were married until he passed away. So, but Marion's life was Habersham Mills. He raised his family there. He did many things to modernize and to keep us on the cutting edge of technology, which amounted to large expenditures back in those days, which obviously he had to justify to the ownership, to the shareholders, and he was able to do that. And he was very. The other thing I remember about him, other than the mill, is the fact that he was very involved with the community. He was very involved with the textile manufacturing operation, Georgia Textile Manufacturers. He was very involved with that group. He was president of that group, president of American Yarn Spinners, probably president of several groups that I'm forgetting at this time. The other thing I remember is we were also members of the Institute of Textile Technology, which was a division of the University of Virginia, headquartered in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we were a member of that group and took advantage of their expertise in terms of guiding the cutting edge technology in textiles. So Marion was very progressive, very community minded, and I think he did a lot to enhance the mill from that standpoint in terms of representing the mill in a very, very professional manner.
Oh, Marion was a wonderful, wonderful man. They had, I don't know what kind of model car it was, but he took us children for a ride in it one time. And that was a big deal. And baseball was our way of life. And he played baseball. And he went away to school, I guess. He was that much older than I was, so I never went to school at the time he was in school.
He might have went to the Army.
Oh, he was in service, wasn't he? Yeah.
In 1977, the mill was purchased by the Russell Corporation, with Marion Stribling acting as president until his retirement in 1981. The mill was not only a solid place to work, but also created an oasis for those living at the mill. There was a post office and a general store. There was also a barber shop, and the mill had its own fire department. The churches at the mill were not only open to all, regardless of religion, but in the early days, they would share one church, with the Methodists and the Baptists taking turns using the church and then all coming together one Sunday a month.
Well, the church, as I said, the private school, he had a huge auditorium. And so one week the Baptists would meet and the next week Methodists would meet. And in 1939, the Baptists had a revival, and it wound up 2 weeks revival, and there's over 100 accepted the Lord, and was baptized. I was one of them baptized in 1939. Had a sister and a brother also baptized in 1939. But we always look forward to the school, and Mr. Striblin always had that open for the Methodists and the Baptists, and of course now that some of the other organizations, they met at different churches, but they was all welcome to come at that time.
I never knew that I was half Methodist and half Baptist until I was grown and moved away. We had a Baptist preacher once a month and a Methodist preacher once a month. And my parents were Baptist, and they were members of the Fairfield Baptist Church, was out in the Fairview community where my grandparents' old home place was, and we would go to church there once a month because they only had a preacher once a month. And I'd always invite the preacher to come home with us. And now I wonder why my mother didn't have better control over me inviting the preacher home so much.
Yeah, when I was just a little boy, the church met in the schoolhouse, the building there, school building, in the auditorium, and in the Sunday school rooms would be out in the classrooms, and the Methodists would be in charge on some services, and then the next service, the Baptists, they kind of swapped it around. And then in 1948, when the Baptists decided to build their own church, which was nearby, there weren't that many Methodists, so instead of trying to keep it going there, they went usually to Clarksville or Cool Springs.
But his dad died at 23, when he was 23 years old, and he was dating my mother. And after my grandfather passed away, my dad and mother got married, and they moved into a Mill Village house. And at that time, the Baptists and the Methodists was using the school house auditorium. They would hold services every other week. But the Holinists, or they call them Pentecostals now, they used just the houses where they would have what they call cottage prayer meetings in the houses. And so they started growing, and there was a Mr. McIntyre that owned property that joined HabershamMill, and he had an old tannery where he tanned hides, and he'd quit using it. So he told these people that were having cottage prayer meetings, you can use the old, they called it the tan house. Said you can use the tan house for worship. So they started worshiping in this tannery, or the old tannery, the tan house. And they began to grow. And so in 1939, there were 7 people that were charter members of Bethel Temple Church. They organized Bethel Temple Church. That was my dad, my mother, Herford and Lurleen Moat, Aunt Hattie Moat, and Aunt Edna Moat. And then there was a Mr. and Mrs. Ed Elrod and a Miss Carrie McIntyre. So after they organized, they were having services in the tan house. And so they began to grow and outgrew that. So they built a smaller, it was a small church then, over closer to the Mill Village. And they stayed in that till about the 50s, and then they built another church that was larger, and then they added on to that, and now we're in our third sanctuary since 1939. But they, to tell you a story about, there was a preacher, 16 years old from White County, and he started preaching, and he tells the story, Reverend Asa Dorsey. He's a preacher that he at one time held the record of having the most funerals in Habersham County. But he tells a story that HabershamMill was his first missionary journey, that he came to HabershamMill, and he would hold services each night in some of these cottage prayer services. But the preachers came in from some from Toccoa and White County and around. But after my mother and dad got married, then he started going to church, and then he started preaching. And they were instrumental in starting the church. And my dad has pastored Bethel. He pastored Bethel Temple Church 3 different times. He was bivocational. He worked in the mill 46 years, and he pastored 8 different churches, country churches, out in Habersham, White, Stevens County, Hall County. But they were instrumental in starting Bethel Temple Church.
And then there was baseball. The HabershamMill formed a baseball team that was part of the Textile League. They would play all of the mills in the area, and they took baseball very seriously.
HabershamMill had a baseball team, and they played in the Textile League. There was teams in Commerce, Georgia. There were teams in Gainesville. There were teams in South Carolina that were part of the Textile League. And Habersham had to go to their fields, and they came to our fields. And when Habersham would go to Gainesville or to Commerce or to Westminster or to Seneca to play, there were not a lot of cars in the mill. But the playing baseball was a really big thing. The mill would take, I have heard, they would take their truck that they used to haul the cotton from Habersham Station and the yarn back to Habersham Station was a large truck. They built sideboards for the trucks. They put benches in the back of the truck, and they carried the baseball team and any members of the families that wanted to go. They would put them in load them up, go down, play the ball, and then come back. Folks would carry their lunches, put them in a lunch basket, carry them down there, and they had a really good time. It was very, very competitive. And I know for a fact, I've heard, I wasn't there, but if there was a real good ball player somewhere and they found out about him at the mill, they would go down and talk to him and try to get him to come back and go to work at the mill. And the mill even helped move some of the folks up there to get them to come and live on the Mill Hill and play on the baseball team.
I was a water boy. Right behind the stadium in Habersham, there's a big spring, and I'd bring water up from the spring for the ball players, and then I would, anytime there was a foul ball over the fence, I had to pick that up, and that way I got to go to other places like Gainesville and Chicopee, Georgia, and like that. I'd get to go with the ball team, and I look forward to that. And if I wasn't playing ball, I was at the river fishing or swimming.
Oh, I remember all the ball games. Our environment consisted of baseball, church, and school. That's about it. But the baseball teams, they had a good. HabershamMill's always had a pretty good baseball team.
Well, I had a neighbor that was with his 2 families lived in the house, and we lived in the 3-room side, and they lived in the 2-room side. He would play ball, he was a pitcher, and he'd go play ball on Saturday night, and he'd come home and him and his wife would get in the fuss. And so to keep me and my brothers and sister from being exposed to that, we would go to the Canadian, to the Grand Theater. It was nice. And they done settled from the ball game, which I know several of the other players that, played there. A lot of the mill employees played, like Doc Allen, Reverend Doc Allen. He was one of the pitchers there. And that's the stories, I repeat stories because I never did go to a professional game, which cost you 10 cents to get in.
I knew baseball from about right after the Second World War. During the Second World War, baseball, it's my understanding, baseball at the mill and in the Industrial League was suspended, I believe. I don't believe it was active at that time, but right after the war, when Marion Stribling came back to the mill, he was very instrumental in getting the team up and going, and we had some good teams. I was, a spectator, served a little time as water boy, served a little time as bat boy, that kind of thing. And, those guys were kind of my heroes, and I'd go over and I wouldn't actually practice with them, but I would try to, maybe when they were warming up, I would catch the ball and try to throw it back to them or do whatever, that I could to participate. I really enjoyed that. I remember the names very well. One thing that I wanted to point out, and I don't remember it being in the book, it possibly was, but one thing that I wanted to mention, we had one individual named S.Y. Stribling III, who was the son of S.Y. Stribling Jr., as we know him, Mr. S.Y. He was very athletic. I've got a picture of him on the 1932 baseball team. He was a pitcher, and I know very little about that because, of course, I wasn't born at that time, but I did some research. He was actually inducted into the Georgia Tech, he attended Georgia Tech. He was inducted into the Georgia Tech Athletic Hall of Fame in 1984, and he was a pitcher on the baseball team in 1934.
Yeah, I used to, my dad, he was a baseball fan, and of course they had the textile leagues in that day, which was in the 40s, most that I can remember from just a little boy. And he would take me on Saturdays, usually it'd be on a Saturday, to a game at the ball field, and they would play in the team from another textile league. And it wasn't a sloppy ball. I mean, it was a good tight ball game, hard fought, and there were good players who worked at the mill. They must have let them practice some in the evenings or something because they were good at what they did. They were men, I feel, could play, be drawing a good salary now on a major league team if the different times was different. But my uncle was a pitcher, one of the pitchers for the Habersham team, and I idolized him because he was my uncle, and I felt that he was a star. And Sylvester Tanksley was another good pitcher, and Ralph Clark. I remember I idolized those pitchers, were my favorites. And Toddy Midlock, of course, he was the catcher for all of us, and then there was a lot of other characters.
Baseball at Habersham was the biggest thing in our social life. The other teams from the other mills that would come to, and there would be students. I remember 2 or 3 from Piedmont in the summertime coming over there to play ball, and they were employed because they couldn't play ball without being employed. And so they painted the houses. One of them was Wiki Loudermilk. One of them was Inman Chambers. There were 3 of them that I remember that summer, but I don't remember the name of the third one.
Baseball, when I was really young, I only remember going to one of the mill villages. The mill had a baseball team, and they would play like New Holland, Gainesville Mill, and the other mills. But I only remember going to one baseball game where the mill team played. But we played, after we got on up older, we had what we called a pickup team. They just a bunch of us get together and we would go play Demorest, we would play Tallulah Falls, we would play Lula, and anybody that had another team. And so the baseball field was used a lot. There was a lot of activity on the baseball field. And even if we wasn't playing another team somewhere else, there was enough children on the mill village so we could have a ball game any afternoon. You just say, number 2 is gonna play this street over here. They'd get up a team, we'd get up a team, and have a ball game.
Soon after the end of World War II and the advent and popularity of automobiles, radio, and television, the baseball frenzy ended at the mill. In the late 1980s through the 1990s, much of the yarn production moved to foreign countries where labor was cheap and less regulated. In 1999, Russell Corporation announced that they would be shutting down operations. On the last day, as they shut down the mill, the workers went out the way it all began. They went up into the old bell tower, and as they left, they rang the old bell one last time. The people of the Habersham Mill are a close-knit group. Since the closing of the mill, and even before, they have gotten together each year at a mill reunion to celebrate their time together. What started as a small barbecue amongst friends has turned into a grand social function around October of each year. The people of Habersham Mill consider themselves lucky to have lived, worked, and grown up in such a fine place.
tell you, I guess my favorite memories is just the people that I worked with. You know, everybody knew everybody because everybody that worked there had been there a long time. You grew up with their children and you knew them. At one time, I could close my eyes and tell you everybody that lived in every house. And there were over, if I remember, around 100 houses or so at HabershamMill. But just the interaction with the people, and it was a good place to work. Everybody had a good sense of humor and always had something funny to tell, and it was a good place to work and enjoyed each other.
Emotionally, it was very sad. The people at the mill were, I would say they're more like a family than anything else. They were a close-knit bunch of people. But when I went to work there, being new, they accepted me and just took me into their group, and I felt like I was one of them. And I learned to love the people at the mill, and had a deep feeling for all of them. And it just, it was a good place to work.
Well, we was always had our little mischievous things we did, you know, and one of the things we always did around, we kept fireworks around New Year's and 4th of July. We'd get fireworks. I don't know who got them or where they come from or what, nothing about it, but we would always have a bunch of fireworks, and we'd go around, and some of the people that didn't like fireworks, we would bomb their house with fireworks. And one of the things I remember is this: I was walking with a friend of mine out the street, and we had cherry bombs, and them things used to be real strong. And I looked at these people's house right beside the road, and I said, "Do you think we can put one down that chimney?" And he said, "I doubt it." And so we lit one, and one of us, we went right down the chimney. We heard it go, poof! You know, you're inside the house, and boy, we ran naturally. And so the lady that lived there told my mother about it. She said when that thing went off, the fireplaces on the inside she said it blew all out, all over the walls, all over the furniture and everything. But I never did tell them that it was one of us. It was just two of us, so one of us did it. He said I did, and I said he did. So you know how that is. But that was something funny that happened. It wasn't too funny to her, but it was pretty funny to us.
It was a great community. It was sort of what we perhaps think we need today in terms of the family involvement in a child's raising and acquiring the sorts of attitudes and so forth that would be helpful today in our society, which is basically suffering from the disintegration of the family. I think to me the strongest point of our mill environment, of our family environment in Habersham Mills, was the fact that the families were involved, they cared for one another, there was virtually no crime whatsoever, we had no police department, and I don't recall of ever having had the police on site. I just don't recall it.
But anyway, after we got too big to get in the wash tub, we had to go to the river to wash off. Yeah.
Community values. We lived by the golden rule over there. If you misbehaved or done anything that you shouldn't, you knew that the word was going to get back and that you would be punished for it. I said a bad word one time, and my older sisters, boy, they saw that I got my punishment for that when we were at a Sunday school outing over at the old church.
What word did you say?
Pardon?
What word did you say?
I don't know what I said.
Really remember. It was profane though.
I just remember the switching I got. I was always switched with we had a hedge in the side of our yard, between our yard and the neighbor yard. And my mother would, if it was punishment time, she would send me to get my switch. And I learned to bend the switch so it didn't sting as bad.
We just did stuff together with the folks. Fishing was a big thing at the mill, and we had a lot of folks had a wooden boat up on the lake, and they kept it there, and everybody went fishing. You'd see fishing, there'd be fishing, folks fishing from the bank, and everything. That was a lot of fun.
Well, dating, you went to church to meet the girls, and then after church, you walked the girls home from church. That was growing up. And then they would have a party and invite the boys. Some of the girls would have a party, and they'd invite girls and boys. I don't know if you're old enough to remember how they would spin the bottle. All the boys would be in a circle, and the girl would spin the bottle, and whoever it pointed to, she'd choose. That's who she had to take a walk with, and you'd walk up the street and back. And that was some of the socializing that we had, was the parties. But most of our socializing was around school and what.
Back then, we didn't have any radios, very few radios, and so we would visit other one or two families that had radios, and the only thing on Saturday night, we'd go Amos and Andy, and anyway, Nashville, Tennessee, the Grand Ole Opry. That's what we look forward to every Saturday night.
Well, I don't know. I guess when we got old enough for somebody to drive, we just load up whatever car was available, and maybe go to a movie or something like that. But we didn't, as far as having really dating, we didn't date. If I wanted to go see a friend of mine that was a girl that lived on the village, I would just go see her. And then if I wanted to go see one of the others another night, I'd go see her, or we'd meet during the day. But it wasn't anything like going steady, we didn't have such a thing as going steady back then, because you knew everybody, and so it was a great time. We had a great time.
Oh, well, I never did get into that. See, I'm still an old bachelor at 75 years old, and dating gang was nothing. What I heard, all I could do is repeat tales of it. And
well, I never started dating until after, but growing up, we had parties at different houses, and we'd play Spin the Bottle. Now, Spin the Bottle was, we used a RC bottle because the RC man used to deliver on his way to the store. He'd stop by our house and unload for us. But the games that we would play was, and whoever the bottle turned to, that's who you went to walk with. And if it was a girl that was spinning the bottle and it didn't land on a boy, then you spun the bottle again until you didn't go out and walk with another girl.
Well, there wasn't a whole lot to do social-wise. Wasn't any television in my boyhood days. We had radios we enjoyed. And the school there usually had activity when it was during the school year, like Halloween. They called them Halloween carnivals instead of fall festivals like they do now, and it was really on Halloween evening. And it was really, they put on good shows. And then we, dating, sometime if we're lucky, the boys would get to walk a girl home from the Halloween carnival. And the ones that didn't get a girl to walk home from the Halloween carnival, the others would follow along behind and kind of harass them, you know. And then as later, there were a few of us got automobiles where we could date. And we'd usually date a local girl from Habersham because they had some mighty pretty girls there. And we didn't have to go far.
Well, I was too young to do any dating. I had a few sweethearts, but about the only thing, my third sister, she dated, and later on she married one of the fellas at HabershamMill. And but the only thing we look forward to, we'd have square dancing at some of the houses. And I always like to go listen to the musicians because I didn't dance, but I could always listen to the musicians, yeah.
But I grew up there I lived there from 1938 to 1967 on the village. And I was born, the house that I was born in is still standing. It's house number 71 over there. It's one of the few that they kind of remodeled. But we lived it was a 5-room house, and I had a brother and 2 sisters. We lived in 3 rooms side of the house, and another gentleman by the name of Robert Adams, and everybody will know Robert, and Mary Adams lived in the other side because they didn't have any children, so they only had 2 rooms.
I reckon one thing, and I'd like to mention this, one of the values I learned after I went to work was the Harry Black had a store right next door to the Habersham property, and he was a great man. And I learned one value I learned from him was really that I started a little credit thing with him, which it wouldn't work nowadays. He had little books, he wrote your name on them, and he never give you a receipt what you got. He just write down, and which he kept a lot of people from starving, going hungry because of the credit, and he delivered actually on the hill too. So, the value I learned there was I'd go pay, at the end of the month, they'd go pay him off, and then I charged some gas and stuff. His gas was 2 cents cheaper than it was ours the meal, so that was one of the values I learned was, you know, how to handle your money a little better.
And you just mentioned Lewis. Well, we just heard that he had a lot of nicknames you gave him. Could you share some of those with us? Lewis's nicknames you gave him and why?
Oh, well, the Fish Luke, he was out of, got expelled one time from school for a few days, and he went fishing every day. He was a great fisherman boy. And I called him Fish Luke, which stayed with him pretty well. And then when he was a teenager, he got wrecked 2 weekends in a row. He wasn't driving, but he was in cars with people that wrecked, that turned over, and I called him Roll Happy. And then later on, a guy that, when stock car racing first became popular, started becoming popular in the pioneer days in the 50s, a guy that loved it in the community and kept up with it. There was a race car driver by the name of Snake Lingerfeld. And so he called Lewis Lingerfeld and called me Snake because we had just started driving and accused us of racing.
When I was in the first grade, we had a rhythm band. My teacher was Miss White, and I played the cymbal. But we got to come to Piedmont College and perform. And that was such a real treat. The only person I knew at Piedmont College was S.Y. Sosby, remember? He was an only child, and he got to come to college over here at Piedmont College. And that was a real treat.
We had it really good. We knew it then, but I know it even better now how good we had it. We didn't worry about much stuff. Didn't worry about much stuff at all, you know. And we didn't have a lot, but we had everything we wanted.